I've traveled to China on and off for around 20 years now, but I lived in the country from 2010 to 2016. China is a much more thriving economy than India. It's slowed down significantly right now. India is growing at a faster pace, but China still remains a thriving economy. One of my favorite experiences of being in China was I used to travel by overnight buses, and when it's morning, the lights would come on and you would have Mohabbate's song Aankhein Khuli Ho Ya Ho Band. In the parks, you see women dancing. On occasions, they would dance to Tu Cheez Badi Hai Mast Mast. The Chinese government was very friendly. If you're a foreign investor and you came into China, you were given the red carpet treatment.
It's not the case now.
It's changed now. It's changed significantly. But in that period, what had happened was that...
And Chinese government is now prioritizing other kind of exports like lithium-ion batteries.
Yeah. Essentially, what the government is saying is that I can no longer compete in manufacturing shoes, blankets, chappals, and so on and so forth. Let Vietnam do it. Let Cambodia do it. There is some debate in China about should India be allowed to do it? Because I think the big positive lesson to learn from the Chinese is...
Over the last 4 decades, China has transformed from one of the poorest countries to its second largest economy. India is also in the race to become world's third largest economy. In this podcast, we talk with Manoj to know what China did to reach where it is now and what India can learn from China. Manoj Kevalramani is Fellow China Studies and the chairperson of the Indo-Pacific Studies program at the Takshila Institution. Do watch this podcast to learn why has India so far was not successful to live up to its economic potential and how can we fix these problems. Hi Manoj, welcome to the Nuance Show.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
So Manoj, India and China have same number of population and people love to compare India and China. So let's just start our discussion with the similarities and differences India and China have.
Okay, so in terms of similarities and differences, I think a lot of our similarities are fairly superficial, right? Obviously, the population size is somewhat similar, although now India has a larger population than China. And India is likely to remain a larger population than China for the foreseeable future because China's population decline is now well and truly set in. In contrast, our fertility rate is much higher. So India is likely to continue to remain the most populous country in the world for a long time to come. In terms of culture, there are some similarities. So Chinese culture is also very family oriented in some way. Just like in India, you'll see when a girl or a boy is sort of marriageable age, you'll see parents sort of looking out for arrangements. In China also, you'll see that it's slightly different. In India, we have marriage bureaus and things like that. In China, you'll have, there are parks in which you'll have photographs with biodatas put up and parents will come on a particular Sunday and check out all the photographs and go. So you'll have that sort of arranged marriage setup. But it's a family-oriented system. There's a concept of inheritance of family wealth and things like that, which again is something that India has in common. I think that's where largely our sort of similarities end, to my view. There's a sort of, again, superficial Asian shared sense of colonial history, although colonialism in China was very different from colonialism in India. China wasn't fully colonized the way India was. Bits and pieces of China were ceded to certain colonial powers. But the central empire, the Chinese government, ruled by the ostensibly Chinese dynasty, stayed. In India, that was not the case, right? You had princely states, but you also had the Raj, and you had a different sort of system. And India was far more colonized than China in that sense. But at a certain level, yes, there is shared experience that exists. But I think that's where broadly our similarities end. India is a hyper-diverse country. China is not a hyper-diverse country. China has some diversity. You have predominantly the population is Han Chinese. Well over 90% of the ethnic population is Han Chinese. Then you have smaller minorities. The Chinese, officially there are over 50 minorities, but they are so small in terms of numbers that it's not significant politically. In contrast, India is a hyper-diverse society, not just from the point of view of language, but ethnicity, religion, and even if you go further below at different levels of magnitude, you will find greater diversity in India. So that's a significant difference. China has historically been a centrally ruled country, right? There's been a strong gravitational push towards the center and a strong central rule in the country. India, on the other hand, has not been that historically. Right? There has been scarcely a dynasty or a rulership in India which has ruled the entire landmass or a significant chunk of the landmass. It's usually been much more fragmented, and decentralization is a far broader trend. The push and pull in India even in modern India, of sort of federal states, or sort of states demanding greater autonomy and the union demanding greater control is continuous, right? And so the tendency is not stronger central rule. The tendency is a push and pull. In China, the tendency is stronger central rule. In terms of economically today, I would say China is a much more thriving economy than India. It's slowed down significantly right now. India is growing at a faster pace. But China still remains a thriving economy. It's a much larger economy, about 5.5 times India's size. Its efficiency and state capacity, I think, is much better than India's, and its ability to deliver on outcomes is much better than India's. The one thing that I think, beyond all this diversity, I think the one thing that I think is in common is that there is a shared culture of enjoying Bollywood music. I think that one of my favorite experiences of being in China was I used to travel by overnight buses at about 5:30 a.m. in the morning when you're close to your destination. The bus would, when it enters a town, and when it's morning, the lights would come on, and you would have Mohabbate's song "Aankhein Khuli Ho Ya Ho Band." So I think that sort of, so there's a shared sense of that. Even on the streets of China, you see in the parks, you see women dancing, elderly women dancing. That's their form of exercise. And on occasions, they would dance to "Tu Cheez Badi Hai Mast Mast," which would again be one of those fascinating experiences of being in China. So you would have those kind of experiences. So I think there's a shared sense of joy for life, which I think exists amongst Indians and Chinese. But in terms of material things, I think there's a big difference between the two countries.
Okay. Like, what's the difference?
In terms of just how we live our lives, in terms of what our pursuits are, in terms of the freedom that we have to engage in those pursuits, in terms of how we deal with the government that we have, and in terms of, again, broader, the economy, the country, the structure, there are big differences, which I just talked about earlier.
Yeah. And for how long you were there in China?
So I've traveled to China on and off for around 20 years now. But I lived in the country from 2010 to 2016. Parts of that was living in south of China for a couple of years and traveling across the country. My father has been a trader all his life. And for over 40 years, he's been doing contract manufacturing and exports from China. So about 2.5 years I spent trying to manage his business. I was not very good at it. And after that, I went back to journalism. But yeah, in those 2.5 years, I sort of traveled around the country while being based in the south of China. So it gave me an opportunity to experience firsthand how Chinese manufacturing functions, how people live. And then for about 3.5 years, I was working with Chinese state media as a foreign expert with Chinese state media. Which again gave you insight into, how Beijing functions, how the political class thinks, how think tanks work, how journalists think, how does the information ecosystem in the country work. So I feel it was quite a holistic experience of, being outside government and being sort of somewhere affiliated with the government system because it's state media, it's owned by the government.
Yeah, and that made you a perfect choice for Dakshina. All that experience.
I hope that's how they look at it.
So, Manu, China is also known as the manufacturing hub in the world, right? How did it reach there? Like, if you break down in steps.
Yeah, I think that, if you go back to when the People's Republic of China was formed in 1949, it was a very, very poor country. Just like when India became independent, India had deep challenges. It was very poor. What has happened since then is that the first about 3 decades were quite challenging. I think they had a mix of policies where they tried to sort of push collectivization, they tried to push mass industrialization, and the idea was that everybody can manufacture steel and things like that. And that led to a lot of backyard factories, which were terribly poor, right? Which had poor productivity, poor output, and so on and so forth. In 1978, they launched a big reform initiative, which is called Reform and Opening Up, which essentially said that everything that is state controlled, which was basically everything in China, your entire life was state controlled, is now going to be liberated, right? We're going to gradually open these things. So from pricing reforms to market reforms to allowing private manufacturing started to happen gradually. You opened yourself up to foreign capital, foreign people, foreign investment, foreign technologies, and that allowed you to essentially broaden the scope of what you were doing. And gradually, over a period of time, you started building manufacturing capacity because you had cheap labor, you were open to foreign capital and technology. And as sort of the years passed by, you stuck with that reform, despite deep internal differences. Around 2001, China joined the WTO, which I think gave it this rocket fuel to sort of launch into this next century. And that I think was a big change, right? You had access to Western markets, you had access to Western capital far deeply than what you had in the past. And the state policy incentivized through subsidies and through other means, for example, by keeping labor rights, by not being very stringent on labor rights, by allowing easy access to land, by subsidizing energy, water, things like that. You incentivized exports and incentivized manufacturing. And that I think has been a trend that was sustained. That is basically what led to this manufacturing boom, right? The idea that you can make everything in this country because now you have access to all of this. You invited foreign companies to come in and set up shop. So you had all these global MNCs that came into China. You weren't necessarily terribly worried about them crowding out your indigenous manufacturing because you wanted capital to come. You encouraged joint ventures. People learned how do you run these companies? How do you manufacture? What are processes? So from technology to processes to management, you learned. And then you started your own sort of systems, own companies, and you grew, right? This was a time where globalization was at its peak.
But how did these companies coexist with Chinese government?
So the Chinese government was very friendly. It was very, very friendly to foreign investors. It was very, if you're a foreign investor and you came into China, you were given the red carpet treatment.
It's not the case now.
It's changed now. It's changed significantly. But in that period, what had happened was that the party's objective was to grow economically, right? The bargain that it had made with the people was that we will give you prosperity. You give us political control and you will not challenge our political control. And they did that, right? So they were open to, say, foreign education. So, New York University, NYU, has a campus in Shanghai. They were open to foreign experts, foreign scholars, foreign technology, foreign talent. And these companies came and they said, hey, look, I don't really care what your governance system is like, provided there is good enough facilities and a good business environment for me, and I can cater to the market. Because what companies want to do is make profits, right? That's their mantra. So the Chinese government said, great, we also want to make profit. Let's do business. Let's not do politics. And for about 15 years, that's what everybody did, and Chinese people made a ton of money. The Chinese government, became well off through export surpluses. Their foreign exchange reserves rose and so on and so forth. So that's essentially the boom. It's about being open, but it's also about governments creating an enabling environment. In that, of course, you had lots of challenges of human rights and things like that. For example, when it comes to labor rights, particularly, right? You would, towards the first decade of the 2000s, towards around 2008 to 10, you'd have read stories of, sweatshops in China manufacturing, Gap t-shirts, or how badly Apple employees are treated who are manufacturing. There were stories of, how people had to leave their homes to migrate and they would live in these factory dormitories, particularly women. But if you looked at it from the perspective of those individuals, what they would largely tell you is that, look, I'm seeing upward social mobility for myself. My father or my grandfather or my uncle 40 years ago in the 70s died of starvation. Today, I'm being able to feed my family. My child is being educated. Yes, my life is not easy, but this is a generational problem and I will overcome it. And today, most of those people, when I meet people in China who are 30, 40 years old, who are around my age, they will tell me I'm much better off, and I could see that social mobility and therefore that pain didn't matter as much. So yes, while sitting in San Francisco, you might have felt like, oh my God, this is a sweatshop. For that person, it was upward social mobility. And as much as they may not be happy with that existence, it meant that their life was improving. So I think that was a bargain that they were making. And that's essentially what happened, right? Foreign companies took advantage of cheap labor, access to all these, resources, and everybody grew until, of course, the last perhaps 10, 12 years where things have changed.
Yeah, I was also having this discussion with Sridhar that migration is not bad. We want people to work in new factories that are being set up. We don't want so many people in villages. Like, we don't need those many people in agriculture, right?
Yeah, you need people to come to urban centers. Urbanization is needed. But I think one of the challenges, and again, China, this is a common challenge with India and China, right? How do you plan your urbanization better? I mean, I just drove down here. It took me an hour and a half to cross 13 kilometers. A lot of that is, to me, yes, there is traffic. Yes, the cities are overcrowded, but it's also bad urban planning, right? I feel that sometimes our cities cater to our whims and fancies rather than actually directing traffic the way it should go. What you will see in China is that there has been better urban planning. It's not that their cities have not grown in an unplanned manner. There has been unplanned growth, but there has been better urban planning. Some of it is positive. Some of it has been problematic. So for example, in China, you have something called the hukou system, which is the household registration system. So if you're a migrant who is moving to a city from, say, a rural area, every individual, wherever you're living, you have a household registration, right? It's sort of your Aadhaar card with your address proof of where you are. That registration allows you to access to public utilities and public services. So education, healthcare, things like that. If you move to a city and you don't have a household registration of that city, you don't get access to subsidized cheap public services in that city. So if you're a migrant who's moved there with a family, either your company gives you that household registration and applies for it for you so that your child can go to school there, or you can get access to subsidized healthcare, or you wing it and you survive however you can survive. So or your children will keep living where their original registration was, whereas you are alone here, which has meant that a lot of people in China live in separate systems like this, where the parents may be living in a city, the children are left behind with their grandparents to take care of them and send them to schools because you can't afford schools in cities. So there is obviously this unplanned nature and this poorly planned structure of urban planning in China. But that is something that I think that they recognize and they're trying to work on it, but it's difficult to do because of the nature of the political economy in the country. In India, what we've done is that unfortunately our urban planning has been very, very poor. Our cities are bursting at its seams. We are struggling with accommodation. We are struggling with facilities. And again, some of it has to do with delays in delivery of projects. So if you look at infrastructure in our cities, it takes a long time to build a metro, which you've probably planned 10 years ago, assuming a population increase of 5 years, which is when your project
We are talking about Bangalore because it's much better in Delhi.
Exactly.
I was in Delhi for almost 7-8 years.
Yeah.
And I think in those 7-8 years, there were so many options to reach a place within metro.
Yeah. No, and I think that Delhi got a boost because of the Commonwealth Games.
Yeah.
That created the urgency to do some of these things. But for example, I lived in Delhi a significant number of years working there as a journalist. I'm originally from Bombay. And I find that if I was to look at Bombay today, I mean, it feels like our cities are perpetually under construction. There is perpetually work going on. Yet we are unable to anticipate population growth and deliver projects on time to do that. There are many reasons for that. There is state capacity, governance challenges, citizen engagement, all of that. But I think that's again one difference between India and China, right? Where China, I think the ability of the government to mobilize and deliver project outcomes on time is far more stronger than India's, right? And again, that's systemic differences. But would I want to be in a place which is much more efficient in delivery, but where my fundamental freedoms are restricted, as opposed to a place where I have significant inefficiencies and it takes me 1.5 hours to travel 13 kilometers, but I potentially have greater freedom to express myself and live my life, right? I think those are the, challenges. And I think 10, 12 years ago, I don't think this was necessarily the case in China, where this was the bargain. In fact, there was lots of pushback against government control. Today, that has receded, right? Today, there is far stronger government control. And this bargain has become far more sharply in focus.
Like, it's just so easy to move around, like move from Delhi to Mumbai, then Mumbai to Bangalore. You just need to change the address on Aadhaar, and it is also all the processes digitized.
Exactly.
You don't have to visit the office.
Exactly. And it doesn't inhibit you from accessing public services, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is a significant drawback in the Chinese system. And I think about a few days ago, they had something called a plenary session which discussed their economy. And this was one of the big reform things, but it's very difficult to do because cities will push back, right? I mean, often, when we discuss India and China, people say India has too much democracy and too much politics, and China functions better because China does not have politics, right? It's single party state, central control. That's not true. It is single party state with strong central control, but there is politics in everything. And there is political pushback and bargaining in every system. It's just that we can't see it as clearly. If you see the signs, if you read the signs, you can see where that pushback is happening. In India, it's in your face, right? So that is a similarity, but also a difference in terms of how our systems work. But yeah, because of politics in China, that reform doesn't happen.
And you also mentioned about access to land, right? And
yeah.
Let's also talk about real estate infrastructure in China. There was a boom, then it's falling down. What's slowly happening?
So this is what happened with the property sector, right? Somewhere around 2008, when the great financial crisis took place in the world, it also hit China. Everybody remembers that the United States, in response to that financial crisis, announced a $700+ billion stimulus package under Obama. But nobody really recalls that China also announced a massive $500+ billion stimulus package because they all felt the strain of that crisis. Where that stimulus money went into was largely real estate. Why did that happen? Because in China, the political economy is such that if I am a city's mayor or a provincial governor or a party chief, I'm going to be in office for a few years, right? The metric by which my political achievement is going to be judged is GDP growth. This used to be the case at that point of time, right? And as I deliver more GDP growth, I am a meritorious individual who's proven track record, and I go up the party ranks, right? So the difference is that Chinese politicians are bureaucrats and politicians of the same party. In India, bureaucrats are different from politicians. So anyway, so those individuals basically sought GDP growth. GDP is essentially a measure of activity in the economy. So when you got access to this money, the stimulus money, to stimulate employment, ensure GDP growth, the best place to do this was to build more. So you built all kinds of things. You built housing. You built useless projects such as big parks, which nobody is going to access. You built bridges on which nobody goes. You built massively beautiful fountains in places where there may be like 2,000 people living. So you have a brilliant, beautiful fountain there. You build cities in cities which nobody lives in and nobody is likely to live in also. Because you had the money, and for the political incentive was to build so that there is GDP growth. Now, whether that asset is going to be productive was not the concern of this guy who was in charge, because he knew that by the time this asset is created, I'm going to be promoted to my next job because I've demonstrated this growth. The problem is the next guys, right? The next guy came, he said, oh, okay, I have money. Let me continue to build. So you ended up building a lot of inventory and a lot of vanity projects, which did not yield anything. So this was wasteful investment, right? And like this, the property boom sort of grew. And obviously, when people are going to look at where am I going to save my money? Now, the Chinese are also big savers like us. So where are you going to save your money? You're going to park your money in the real estate sector because it's booming, like it's growing consistently. Because there's constantly money coming in. At a certain point of time, you can see that there's a bubble building because you have ghost towns around the country where nobody's living. In order to demonstrate further activity, in some places where you've built these beautiful towers, after some years, you destroyed these towers and you rebuilt them, right? Because you had to create activity and employment. So public money is parked in that. There's a big bubble there. The government is worried that sooner or later this bubble will burst. And there will be political pushback because people will be on the streets. And of course, banks are leveraged because all this money is going through the banking system and it's going as loans to these developers. And if none of this is productive, at the end of the day, the developers will default on their loans. It'll come back to the banks. There'll be a run on the banks and there will be full public cry. So how do you deal with this challenge? It's a structural problem. You can't wish it away. The real estate sector accounts for anywhere between 25 to 30% of the Chinese economy. So in 2020, in the midst of the Chinese government decided that, look, we need to deal with this problem because there's a moral hazard here. How do we deal with it? They said, look, we are going to put these 3 red lines on developers borrowing money. That you need to demonstrate certain reserve capacity, you need to demonstrate certain viability. There were 3 specific lines that were put out. Only then can you borrow more money from banks. This immediately meant that the developers who had become used to easy money suddenly started facing a crunch. So a lot of property which was sold but not completed stalled. A lot of unsold property, people stopped buying because people knew prices will fall. So you ended up in a case of stagnation, and then subsequently that stagnation led to companies failing because you could not deliver on projects, you didn't have access to capital. So this was a government enforced process of slowdown in order to deal with the moral hazard and in order to divert money away from the property sector into the manufacturing sector. Because from the Chinese government's point of view, the future of China is advanced manufacturing, intelligent manufacturing, green manufacturing. They need to focus on technology. So what you have seen over the last 3 years, and there are wonderful charts to show that every year, property sector investment falls by about 9-10%. Access to capital for developers falls by about 13 to 15%. Whereas the manufacturing sector investment rises. So banks are being incentivized to transfer money over there. And they've said we need to focus on high-end manufacturing, go up the value chain, invest in high technologies. So your current exports that you're looking at, whether it is lithium-ion batteries, whether it is EVs, all of that is a product of this, that you have shifted that flow of capital to these domains. And you're saying that our future exports, we will still be export-oriented, but it has to be in these domains because I can no longer compete in manufacturing shoes, blankets, chappals, and so on and so forth. Let Vietnam do it, let Cambodia do it. If India does it, okay, India can do it. Let Bangladesh do it in textiles and garments in particular, because we are no longer competitive in that, and they are also deeply polluting, and we can no longer sustain that, right? We need to move up the value chain. There is some debate in China about let India do it. Should India be allowed to do it? Because their argument is, why are we even in this low-end manufacturing? Yes, Shanghai, Jiangsu, these rich coastal provinces can no longer do it because the competitive advantages are not there as much, particularly on price. But the interior provinces, the hinterland provinces, which are relatively less well off, which are poor in fact, they can do it. So why don't we transfer our capacity there instead of letting the capacity go to India? Now the problem is that the connectivity of those provinces to the outside world is not as great, because they are landlocked. So as compared to the coastal provinces, so they've built these rail connections to try and transport, but they are still not price competitive to do that through rail and things like that. Also, you will need to transfer technology, skills, people, and all that, and that's challenging, right? And most of these hinterland provinces are also ethnic minority provinces where there have been political disturbances. So it's difficult to make that transition. So at the end of the day, a business has to take a decision. And if I'm a business person, I'm going to look at Cambodia and Vietnam, even a Chinese business person, and say, I'll go there. I have great port connectivity. I'm going to get great facilities. I'll do it cheaper and I'll make profits. So there is a limit to which the government can control private business decisions. And that applies to China also. So that's the sort of push and pull going on right now. So if a government is throwing open the doors, laying out the red carpet, you'd say, yes, I mean, I'm getting profits. Why will I not take that, right? But there is a cost to it, which today Western businesses are realizing that as China has become competitive in domains where the West is competing against them, it is pushing back, So when it comes to EVs, its support goes to its companies as opposed to necessarily Tesla on a whole, right? Although Tesla has a massive factory in Shanghai. But the approach is that we will support our companies. And that's why BYD today is much, much bigger than Tesla. Likewise, the companies that came in with joint ventures, sooner or later, their joint venture partners got the skills, understood the technology, understood the processes, and broke away, and then were preferred by local governments for their subsidies and their support systems. So then they became competitors of their former partners, and they then eroded the market share of their former partners. And now they are globally competitive. So you've seen, governments systematically do this, which I think is really smart policy.
Yes.
I think India should be, and I think this government particularly has actually done part of this. And if you read Chinese scholars and analysts, they complain about this. And it gives me a good chuckle because it's like, okay, you're getting paid back in your own coin. But I think it's good policy. The fundamental message that I would take back is that yes, there are significant challenges that we need to address domestically on factor market reforms, on land, labor, capital. I would want India to be much more open to foreign capital, foreign talent, foreign technology. There is no reason why, again, Shanghai can have an NYU campus and we can't seem to get foreign education into India. We constantly complain about the fact that India suffers from brain drain. The best and the brightest tend to go out. I don't understand why we constantly struggle with the fact that there is not enough educational capacity in the country, right, to absorb the students. Why can't we be open to foreign capital and foreign technology and foreign
This will
education?
also solve the problem of unemployment or skill issue, right?
Exactly. You need to bring more knowledge, more capacity into the country. And if there are others who are willing to bring it, of course they will be for profit. Let them bring it. We should be welcoming that instead of cloistering ourselves by feeling afraid that there is some ulterior motive. You need to, when a paranoid communist country could do that with confidence, I think India should be able to do something like that with confidence. So there are lessons to learn from how China did this.
Well, this was really interesting. Yeah, I didn't think about it because I was having the conversation with Sridhar. We were just talking about unemployment that, like I shared one experience where 10 job vacancies were there and it was happening inside a hotel in Gujarat and 1,800 people showed up for that interview.
Yeah.
So and people are overqualified for that job. So I think this is a great suggestion, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people are going to US for that kind of education, and the good change that we are seeing is most of them are now coming back.
Yeah.
There was this trend earlier that IITians would go out to study further or for IT jobs, and then they would never come back.
Yeah.
Now I think the kind of impact these people can create in India, because of that impact, they are coming back.
And from what I understand, I mean, speaking to people in different governments, speaking to different consulates and embassies here, they want to. The struggle is of the Indian system placing barriers. You want to have university partnerships. What do they need? They need access to land. They need access to, and they need degree recognition. We seem to be bureaucratically too slow in doing that. I think those are the kinds of things where if India optimizes, the rate at which you expand can be very, very quick. And I think that's the one thing that China showed us, that if you do these small optimizations and opening efforts, the multiplier effect that kicks in, you won't even realize it when you're doing them, right? And suddenly you'll see like, okay, this has suddenly boosted everything. Instead, what we seem to be learning from China is industrial policy is good. And I don't think that is necessarily what India should be learning. Yes, in some cases we need to have industrial policy, but not across the board. We don't have the money to waste. People talk about, like we discussed China's property sector and, how much it's grown and, these beautiful buildings that you see, but it's an incredible waste of capital. Can India afford to waste that degree of capital? We have, as part of industrial policy now, we have PLI schemes. I'm not against the schemes. I think they are useful. But the problem is that once you have PLI schemes with multiple objectives, one objective is national security, one objective is removing import dependence, one objective is generating employment, then you are dividing your capital in so many different areas. If you're thinking about employment as your goal, you will look at high employment generation domains, right? And suddenly you will say, oh, toys, we have PLI schemes for toys. But why do you need to have PLI schemes for toys? Why should state be doing that? If people want to manufacture cheap toys in India, enable the environment, let them go and manufacture it. If people want to import toys because they are cheaper, it's okay. Let them import toys. Consumer welfare is happening, it's okay. Those who are manufacturing toys can look at some other sector to manufacture in. Instead, you use state capital on what you see as strategically important domains. Semiconductors, strategically important. You need certain kinds of dependencies to go. There may be others. There may be critical minerals where you support. You don't need to do it for everything. Why do you need a PLI scheme for furniture making? Is furniture making critical to the economy? Does it matter? It creates high levels of employment. Yes. Create an enabling environment by reducing taxes, reducing, costs that go in, instead of subsidizing them through state capital and then intervening in that market. Don't do it. So I think that it's really important to focus our industrial policy, rather than learn from the Chinese and say, we'll spend on everything, because the Chinese are okay with wasteful investment. They have money to waste and they are okay with wasteful investment. We don't. So we should not be doing that.
Yeah, so we need to create employment the smart way. We don't need just opportunities where overqualified people are just engaged.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So I think those are some of the things that I think we should learn. Some of the negative lessons along with some of the positive lessons, right? I think the big positive lesson to learn from the Chinese is ability of the state to deliver, mobilize people and deliver. I think that is something, we should imbibe, that what kind of state capacity is needed to do some of these things. Another really good lesson to learn from them is China grew at its best when it allowed people to experiment. So there was no one China model. There were multiple China models. Every province, every city could experiment under the broad goal that we need to expand GDP growth. And the best outcomes were then replicated in other domains if they wanted to replicate it.
But in India, are we at a stage where we can afford to do?
We should. I mean, but particularly in a hyper-diverse country. In a hyper-diverse country, the more you try to establish central control over everything, the worse off your outcomes are likely to be. If you liberate people to do things without necessarily placing unnecessary restrictions on them, and which a lot of these restrictions can also come from local governments. So for example, but your employment, your hiring must be this percentage of this population, your name must be this type. Unless you liberate people from all of that, let them chase money, which I think is something, again, it's good to learn from China. Let people chase money rather than political objectives. Once you start doing that, you will see a more well-off society who will be free to create, experiment, do things. And you will see answers to your problems. The moment you constrain them within certain identity silos, which unfortunately is what happens in India, it makes it much more difficult, right? It feels like an environment in which you're being strangled. Let people be. Let people go and innovate. Create enabling environments for them to go and do that. And that the Chinese did very well until, say, 2009, 10, 11. After that, things changed. And that's why we are also seeing, the more central control, the more central direction, the less quality of output. And the less focus on people, the more focus on what the state needs. So in this push and
health
pull,
conditions.
As an individual, I need my life to get better. And the whole idea is that as all of us chase our dreams and betterments of our lives, collectively all boats start to rise. Increasingly, that mantra has sort of been forgotten to something to the effect of the state must continuously, collectively push people up and pull people up, which is a very Chinese way of doing things. And, and when the Chinese didn't do what they were doing from the 80s till the first decade of this year, they were actually booming in their growth. As they started to tighten state control, things have worsened. So I think that is a lesson that we should take away, that you need to let go of control. You need to let people experiment, let people innovate while creating enabling environments. That is on economic policy, that is on rule of law, that is on judicial policy, in terms of, say, how judiciary works, how quickly it dispenses justice and things like that. You need to fix those things. People will figure out ways to make money. People will figure out ways to solve our problems.
We have definitely worked on our infrastructure and compliance thing, and the Indians have started shifting back.
Exactly. So see, infrastructure is an enabling environment, right? If you create good infrastructure which connects your ports to inland facilities, you will automatically be able to attract investment inland and they will be able to export. You don't need to necessarily give them 50% duty drawback and all of that. You can start tailoring those essential subsidies by creating, and again, the Chinese did this very well. Chinese connectivity to ports is brilliant. And that's why even if capital is wanting to come to India, they will look at those factors and say, look, it's a cost and I can't do this therefore. So I'd rather bear the political cost of being in China because overall cost becomes lower because of this connectivity. Whereas come to India, struggle with this. So government should focus on this, create enabling environment rather than directing people that in which way they should be looking to grow.
What an amazing discussion. Super insightful. Thank you so much joining us, Manoj. It was very nice having this conversation with you. And Manoj has to step out to pick his son from school. So we are cutting it down here. But I'm sure we need part 2 of this conversation soon.
No, thank you so much for
Thank you
having
so
me.
much
It
for
was so much
joining
fun and always open for a part 2.
Sure. We'll do it soon.
Thank you.